Als je hem pijn doet, ben je hem kwijt voor altijd.
Hello, good evening. Nice introduction. Well, science, cocktails, and sex sounds like the perfect combo, right? I'm happy to see you here all, and today we're going to talk about sexual pleasure. But first of all, I want to dedicate this talk to Ellen Laan. She's a famous Dutch sexologist. She was based here in Amsterdam, and unfortunately, she passed away last year. Otherwise, she would have stand here to talk about sexual pleasure. It was her mission to promote pleasure, especially among women. So we want to spread her word. So we're really inspired by her. So I want to dedicate this to Ellen. Now, if I would ask you the question, what is sex? Just think about it. What means sex to you? And probably there will be very different answers. Like some people might say sex is cuddling and kissing and it's intimacy. Others say, no, it's really the genital touching. Is it penetration? A lot of people will have a quite narrow definition of sexuality, meaning penis in vagina contact. But obviously, sex is much more. And it means very different things for many different people. Why do we have sex? Well, there are actually 237 reasons why we have sex. And the most obvious reason is reproduction, because we want to reproduce. But if you think about it, let's say people have more or less 2 children, and if you then have like 30 times trying to get pregnant, well, let's say most people will have more than 60 times sex in their life, or maybe less, but let's say more. So reproduction can certainly not be the only reason why we have sex. So what is the main reason to have sex? It's pleasure, because it's fun. We want to have sex because we just like it. We consider it as a fun activity. That's why we repeat it all the time. Now, there are also other reasons, and I'm not going to list all the reasons, but I think it's really important to consider that if you think about why do I have sex with my partner, that every reason is okay. Even having routine sex, if you say, well, we just have sex because it's Friday and on Friday we have sex, that's okay. It's okay if it's not the only reason to have sex. If you have sex once in a while because you really are passionate about it and enjoy it, I think it's important that we have kind of this flexibility and variety in motives. But let's go back to this idea that the most important reason to have sex is because we like it. We have pleasure by having sex. Why is it then that pleasure has been ignored for such a long time, and especially the female sexual pleasure? That is because in science, but also in our society in general, we have this male gaze. And a lot of times, sex has been studied from a biological perspective. And biology means reproduction. So what do we need for reproduction? We need to make sure that the penis ejaculates in the vagina so that you can reproduce. So we know a lot about the penis. We know a lot about ejaculation. We don't know a lot about the clitoris. Why would we? It's not functional for reproduction. We don't know about our experience, whether it's fun or not. It's not necessary. We just need to make sure that the penis gets into the vagina and that we can reproduce. Now, it's only since 1998, so about 25 years, that we know how the clitoris looks like. And I hope that by now everyone knows this picture. It has been promoted in the media. This is the clitoris. This is the female sexual organ. Stop thinking that we have the penis and the vagina. That's biology. It's penis and clitoris. The vagina has nothing to do with pleasure. So the clitoris, what is the clitoris? Well, it is more than this little knot that is located outside. It's a big clitoral complex. It's full of nerves, and it's located deep into the vagina. It includes a glans, it has the corpus cavernosum, it also gets into erection, it gets swollen, the same as a penis. And this is important, because this corpus cavernosum, these 2 little legs, these embrace the vagina and the urethra. These are the airbags, these get swollen during sex, which is important to protect the vagina and the urethra during penetration. And what happens is when this clitoral complex gets swollen, it gets into erection, then there's kind of a blood flow towards this area, which creates pressure. And because of this pressure, plasma is pushed outward. This is actually the vaginal lubrication. So what do we need to experience penetration as pleasurable? A wet vagina. And what do you need to have a wet vagina? You need to have a clitoral complex that is swollen, so you need to stimulate the clitoris. And this is fundamental. We're always focusing on the vagina, but we don't need to stimulate the vagina, you need to stimulate the clitoris. That's why we get a wet vagina, that's why we like sex. And if you look at this clitoral complex, in a relaxed state, it's like, it gets really big during arousal, in erection, so you can see the same mechanisms as we see in a penis. And often we talk about the clitoris as being a small penis because it also has a glans and a foreskin and this corpus cavernosum, this swell tissue. But you know, it's actually the penis who is actually a big clitoris, because in the womb we start from a female base. We start with a little clitoris, and it's under the influence of hormones that this clitoris becomes a penis. But again, we have this male dominance, this male gaze. Well, the clitoris is a small penis. No, it's the other way around. So pleasure is important, and still it has been ignored. Why? Because we see sex as this uncontrollable biological drive, this urge that suddenly comes up. So we need to control it. We need to repress it. It's dangerous. It's a threat to our social order. It's a pathology. Overt expressions of sexuality, homosexuality, masturbation, it has for a long time been seen as a pathology. It's something that we need to inhibit, something that we need to repress. And especially when it comes to the female sexual pleasure. Sexual pleasure in men comes first, and people think, well, penis and vagina contact is important for reproduction, so this must be the most pleasurable act. Well, it is for men, but it's not for women. Female sexual pleasure has been ignored because, well, first of all, the clitoris, it was a mystery. It has already been discovered somewhere in the Middle Ages, but people didn't really know what is this strange thing. Let's focus on the vagina, that's clear. It has no reproductive function, it's dangerous. Also the idea that women don't need a penis to have pleasure. Women don't need men to have pleasure. That was very threatening in our male-dominant world. Also religion in general, the socio-cultural repression of women is also contributing to this repression of female sexual pleasure. Now, if we want to understand these gender differences, this idea that we have this male dominance and female sexual pleasure and male sexual pleasure, let's first see how does the sexual system work. First of all, sexual desire does not pop up spontaneously. There needs to be a stimulus, something that triggers our sexual system, which can be a thought, a fantasy, a touch, a visual, something. It can already be that during the day you pick up all these signals. Automatically, you see a lot of our sexual system is triggered all the time, but we have this kind of brake system, this inhibition system that inhibits acting on all these sexual stimuli, because otherwise that would be terrible. So we have our inborn inhibition system, and once in a while, when the circumstances are okay, we put like the gas on, we can sort of disinhibit. But first of all, there needs to be the sexual stimulus that will automatically grab our attention, which will automatically activate, trigger genital arousal, which is erection in men, lubrication in women. Now, what is very important, this genital arousal says nothing about consent or pleasure or desire. This is just your brain is picking up a signal, your body reacts. It's the moment we become aware of these bodily reactions and that we assign a positive meaning to it, that we assign a positive meaning to the sexual stimulus, and the circumstances are okay, so we expect something pleasurable, then we have this subjective sense of arousal and the desire to actually do something with it. So this is crucial. The desire in sex grows. You get the desire by doing it. So it often happens that when you start in a sexual act, when your partner takes the initiative, at that point, yes, you're not thinking about sex. You're not having desire at that moment yet. But if you open yourself for the stimulation, if you have a history of positive experiences with this partner, you will be more likely to open yourself for this experience. And then this desire, this arousal will grow. And this is crucial. So stop thinking that sexual desire is something spontaneous. It's not. There's like a system behind it. What is also very important is that the sexual system works the same for men and women. So we are always focusing on gender differences, but basically we really are the same. We already proved that anatomically we're the same, but also functionally. We actually function the same. So there is clearly this difference between our genital arousal, how our body reacts, and then how our mind thinks about sexuality. And when we study this, obviously we want to study sexual arousal. If you study sexual arousal, you always need to take into account both components. So see what happens in the body and then how you feel. How do we measure this? We have these devices, which is the vaginal plethysmograph, which is kind of a tampon-like device that women have to insert into the vagina so we can measure the vaginal blood flow. And then we have the penile plethysmograph, which is a simple thing we put around the penis, and then we can measure their erection. And what we see, so what we do is we bring people into the lab, they watch porn, and then we measure their genital arousal and their subjective arousal. They need to indicate, they have a response box on their lab, and then they just have to indicate how aroused are you. Like every 30 seconds there's a question on the screen, and they indicate their subjective sense of arousal. Now what we see is that in men, their genital arousal and their subjective arousal match. So when they have an erection, they also feel aroused. In women, we often see a disconnection. So their body reacts, but they don't feel sexually aroused. And we always tend to see this as something wrong because the male response is our norm. And then there's something wrong. Women, we are broken, or maybe we are in denial, because often people think, well, the genital arousal, that's the real response. And we can see that women also, when you present them with porn, even the typical male-oriented porn, their body reacts within milliseconds. We get this lubrication response, but they don't feel aroused. And then people say, well, you're in denial. It's just because you see your body reacts. But you know, again, this bodily reaction is something different than your subjective arousal. The one is not better than the other. I mean, I think it's really important to consider, for example, that if your body reacts during negative experiences, like during rape, this could also happen, that you get this automatic lubrication response. Obviously, you don't feel aroused. And this can sort of create a lot of guilt in women, also in men, that you have this automatic bodily response. So it's clearly something different. So I think that this subjective sense of arousal is equally important, because that's the full-blown sexual response. I mean, if you're able to experience penetration, but you don't feel anything with it, what's the fun, right? So the crucial thing here is the question, is sex rewarding enough? Because if your body reacts, it's only when you assign a positive meaning, it's only when you expect, hey, there will be something fun, that the desire grows, which makes sense. Why would you desire something that is not fun? So this reward is so important, and I think that is the crucial thing. Men and women do not differ in their capacity to experience sexual pleasure, but in the opportunities to experience sexual pleasure. I'm going to explain that a little bit later. So it's really important just seeing how the sexual system works. We have the same capacity to experience genital arousal, subjective arousal, desire. But why? Why do we focus so much on gender differences? Because if we look at the evidence, there's much more overlap. There's about, if we look at different sexual behaviors, and there was like a big meta-analysis, 80% of overlap. And still, gender differences in sexuality, men come from Mars and women come from Venus, it's all over the internet. Why? Why are we focusing so much on these differences? Well, there's actually much more overlap. I think if you look for differences, you will find differences. So let's focus a little bit more on similarities between men and women. What are the behaviors in which we can find some differences? Men watch more porn. Okay. But there's much more male-oriented porn available. And luckily, this kind of is changing nowadays. There's also more the female-friendly porn at the porno. There are erotic podcasts, erotic stories. We have a much more diversity when it comes to sexual stimuli. So I think we're getting there. I think that women start to kind of watch porn, and we have more porn that actually matches our desires. Men tend to masturbate more, but also it might be because of the anatomical makeup. I think that men have external genitalia. They have much more experience with touching their penis because from childhood on, they need to touch their penis to pee. So the threshold to start playing with the penis is much lower than in women. You need to really discover the genital area. So this might explain why men masturbate more than women, although again, we're catching up as women. Men tend to have more sexual partners more interested in casual sex, but that could also be kind of a social desirability bias, because we do have this society in which women are learned to inhibit their sexual desires and their sexual expression. So if you ask about sexual partners, there's a lot of slut shaming. If you had 20, 30 partners as a woman, you might be a little bit reluctant to tell that to the other one. But if you as a man had 20, 30 partners, you're a hero, you're experienced. So there's kind of this double sexual moral, which might explain why women are a little bit reluctant to openly talk about one-night stands, casual sex, and so on. So women do not have less desire than men. These gender differences, they're like exaggerated. It is important, why do women have less desire? Because sex is not rewarding enough. And I'm especially talking here about heterosexual women. Because it's so important to consider that the way we have sex, especially in heterosexual couples, is oriented towards the male sexual script, which is directed towards penetration. Penetration is fun for men. It's warm, it's moist, it's really nice for the penis to be in the vagina. But for women, we need clitoral stimulation. So it's really strange that we expect that men, what do you do to arouse men? You touch their penis. But women need to get aroused without touching their clitoris, knowing that the clitoris is the equivalent of the penis. So there's a strange way of thinking. Women have less experience with the genitals, and what we in general see that this disconnection between body and mind is quite typical for women. It's not only in the sexual level. We know that men are kind of more focused on themselves. They're better able to read their own signals. Women are more focused on the context and might have an evolutionary reason that women are always taking care for others. Men can be more egocentric and focus on themselves. Now, libido. If we think about the sexual system, well, libido does not exist. Freud has done great things, but one thing that he did completely wrong is making the difference between the clitoral and the vaginal orgasm, which I'm going to explain, and the fact that he introduced libido as being this inner drive that needs to be somehow released. So every 2 weeks, you need to kind of have a climax to get this sexual energy thriving. We don't die if we don't have sex. It might be the end of the species, but as an individual, we will not die. It's not necessary. It's not the same as hunger or thirst. So libido does not exist. What is sexual desire? There needs to be a stimulus. Your system gets aroused, and it's sexual motivation. So the question is not, do I desire sex at the moment, but am I motivated to open myself for the sexual stimulation? Are the circumstances okay? Do I feel safe with this person? Do I feel connected with this person? That will sort of open yourself for sexual stimulation. In that sense, I think it's also interesting to think about sexual desire in the context of a relationship. Because in a relationship, we often see that there are discrepancies in sexual desire, that one partner wants more desire than the other, which is perfectly normal, right? Because we're two individuals and people have different desires, different things on their mind. Sexual desire is variable. It depends on so many contexts. So it's very normal that this desire will vary across time and that you don't vary at the same pace or at the same time. It's very unlikely that two people always want the same at the same time. So there will be discrepancies in sexual desire. And we always have the tendency to consider the partner with the low desire as the one with the problem, and then the one with the high desire, that's our benchmark. That's where we need to go. But, this is a couple problem. You both have a problem. Your desire is too high, and yours is too low. So let's see whether we can find a balance, whether we can compromise. So we talk about a mismatch in sexual desire. So I'm not really a big fan of individual desire problems. Obviously, you can have problems with desire in the sense that you miss it, that it was there before and now you miss it. But oftentimes there are differences in how often you want sex, but also in what you exactly want. One partner wants more anal sex, watching porn. The other one wants more soft sex, vanilla sex. There are differences, and that's very normal to have that in relationships. What is really important is also the idea of the good enough sex, because if you think about these differences in desire, a lot of expectations about desire are driven by societal views about media, passionate sex. It's all over the media. We always kind of want sex all the time, and it's very passionate. But that's not realistic, not in daily life. We have all these things on our mind. If you always aim for this passionate sex, you might get inactive. So just settle for good enough. Good enough sex is good enough. It's okay. It's very normal to have once in a while like this very routine, okay sex. Obviously, you do not need to settle for that it's always like good enough. You can really expect something more passionate, but not all the time. That's not realistic. That's not the goal. Broaden the sexual repertoire, compromise. I think it's really important. If you feel like at a certain point you start dating, you discover each other, you kind of write what we call a sexual script. You know what you want, you know what the other wants. But you know, once in a while you need to rewrite your script, because what has been satisfying for 5 or 10 years might not be satisfying anymore. So it's sometimes just finding new ways to stimulate each other and compromising. Sometimes we don't know what the other partner wants. So just making a wish list or a wish box, you just write on cards what you like, what you would prefer, and you put them in 2 boxes. And then 2 times a week, you take a card. And one time your box, the other time the other box, and you discuss it. There's no, obligation to do what's on that card, but at least you communicate about it, and you can sort of discover what you want, what your fantasies are. Communication is this key. I think the most important part, when there are differences in sexual desire, when you're not satisfied, talk with each other. This is so crucial. It's exploring what you want, that's the first thing. And then it's communicating, explaining to the other what you want. And that's one of the most important parts in sexual pleasure. Another important thing is differentiation. What is differentiation? A lot of couples are like really enmeshed, in the sense that they do everything together, they love each other, it's about we, it's about us, which is good, but it also needs to be I and you. This is really important. Keeping the me time, keeping some differentiation, because if there is no lack, you cannot desire if the partner is always available. And this is something we often see during the stages of a relationship. We start with the very passionate love, infatuation, we constantly think about the partner, we constantly want to be together. Your sexual system is always on, because that's what infatuation does. The first stage is really like a permanent state of arousal. So obviously there's a spontaneous feeling of spontaneous desire. Yeah, the sexual system is always on. But obviously that's not adaptive. It costs a lot of time, of energy. You cannot work, you cannot do anything else than thinking about your partner. So it doesn't make sense. It's very normal to evolve towards a more like what we call companionate love, which is based on attachment, routine, commitment. But there's kind of this problem, because sex thrives on novelty and mystery, and then routine, security is kind of a killer of the sex drive. So in a relationship, you always kind of need to balance between this passion and companionship. The problem is that in our current society, we have this novelty, excitement, passionate love as the ideal, and a lot of times we get disappointed in our relationships because that is what we strive for. Just be aware that it's not, it's very normal to develop a more secure relationship that is based on routine and companionship, which is in the long term more sustainable. But why does this sexual desire decline in long-term relationships? As I said, the partner is always available, so there's no lack. In the beginning of the relationship, when you're dating, you're really desiring to see your partner. A lack of differentiation can be an important reason. Less romance. I think this is so crucial, because when we talk about sex, we also talk about relationships. And in the beginning of the relationship, you make the effort. You seduce. You write nice notes, text messages, nice lingerie. You do effort for each other. You seduce each other, which is an important motivator to open yourself for sexuality. Also, there's routine, and also routine in the sexual script, because in the beginning you explore. Once you know the buttons, you touch the buttons, you know, if I do that, he will get aroused, which is kind of a very mechanical, efficient way of having sex, but it's not really exciting, right? Priorities, we have family, work, household, so there might be less me time. Sex is not on the priority. There's a to-do list, which also detracts us from sexual desire. Maybe you invest less in yourself, you feel less sexy, and we know that feeling sexy is one of the most important triggers for sexual desire. So taking care of yourself is so important. Feeling attractive, but also feeling attracted to your partner. And then finally, people with children, there's this conflict between being parents and you don't see yourself as love partners anymore, which also contributes to this decline in sexual desire. So if we think about sexual desire in the context of relationships, I did some research on that because we wanted to study, okay, what about sex in a daily context? What is now the function of sex? So we did a daily diary. So we asked couples to respond to certain questions during 3 weeks. So they had an app on their phone. In the evening, they needed to fill in some questions about their mood. How was your day? How did you behave towards your partner? How was your partner regarding you? What about your relationship? So they needed to fill in just context. In the morning, they needed to fill in the questions about, did you have sex? That was then oral touching, genital touching, penetration. Did you cuddle or kiss, like intimacy? So no genital touching. And then masturbation. And so this is really, they needed to fill that in. During the past 24 hours, did you engage in any of this behavior? So we wanted to see whether how you felt and behaved towards a partner during the day, whether that could predict whether you would have sex and have intimacy. And when you had sex and intimacy, how did you feel the following day? What was the impact on your mood, on your partner behavior? So what did we find in men, because this was in heterosexual couples? We found that when they felt more positive, like positive mood, more positive partner behavior, more satisfied with the relationship, there was a higher incidence of sex. And when they had sex, it has a positive impact on their mood, on their partner behavior, on the relationship. We found the same in women. Although in women we saw that having sex especially had an impact on more relationship variables. It didn't really make them feel better about themselves, but they clearly felt better about the relationship. When we think about intimacy, the same factors predicted intimacy as sex. And this is really important because we always think sex is important for men and women just want to cuddle and kiss. They want intimacy. Well, the same applies for men. Men also want intimacy. The same variables predicted intimacy and the same impact. So when they cuddled and kissed, the following day, men experienced a better mood. They had more positive feelings about the relationship and about their partner. The same applied for women. So again, here you see gender differences. I don't see them. It was interesting to see what masturbation did, because it did seem that masturbation was somehow experienced as something negative in men. Because when they felt bad about their partner, when they had like less satisfaction with the relationship, they were more inclined to start masturbating. And when they masturbated, that actually had a negative impact on their mood and their perception of the partner the following day. So it seems that for men, masturbation was kind of a signal, no, I'm not feeling well, I'm kind of masturbating. But for women, we didn't really find what predicted masturbation in women, but what we did see is that when women masturbated, it has a positive impact because it reduced their negative mood. They were less stressed, they were more relaxed. So it seems that masturbation is experienced as something very pleasurable in women. It has a positive impact. So I think what is important based on this study is that intimacy and sex are important in the context of a relationship, that there are actually not many differences between men and women. Men want intimacy as well, and cuddling and kissing contributes to their positive feelings about themselves and the relationship. Perceived partner responsiveness. What is that? It's this idea that the partner is there when you need him, that you feel supported, validated, understood by your partner. That was actually the most influential factor. And this is so crucial. If you're in a relationship, making the effort, being there offering a secure base to your partner is so important because that is one of the biggest motivations to open yourself for sexual stimulation. So be nice to each other. I think this is one of the main conclusions of this study, is that your foreplay does not start in the bedroom. Your daily context is the foreplay. And this is so important. So if you want to experience more pleasure, more desire, you need to create the opportunities to open yourself for sexual desire, which means seducing each other, being nice to each other, being responsive, making time. That's why we like agenda sex and planning sex and date nights, because at least you create the opportunity to be intimate. You don't have to have sex, but at least there is this opportunity, because otherwise we plan everything in our life. We have a busy schedule, and sex is the only thing that somehow spontaneously needs to pop up. That's not realistic. Why don't we plan sex? Then at least it will happen. So I think that's one of the biggest messages I want to give to you. Don't think about this spontaneous sex. And as I already said in the beginning, if I talk about, if I see clients with sexual problems and I explain that they need to do homework assignments to plan sex, then it's like, come on, I'm not going to do that. Like in the beginning, it was all so spontaneous. But as I said, first of all, your sexual system is constantly on. It's also a hormonal thing. But secondly, yeah, it's not spontaneous, because when you're dating and you see your partner, you're constantly thinking about, oh, I'm going to have sex tonight, and you're shaving and you have a nice odor and you have sexy lingerie. So you're preparing in your mind, you're triggering your sexual system, and then you see your partner and it's like, wow, release, because you were preparing. So that's what date night can do, that mentally you prepare for having a nice time with your partner. So take that as a tip. So sex in a daily context. Okay, so we do diary research. So if you want to know about what happens in sex, we can measure that indeed when people are at home, we ask them questions. But obviously, we also want to understand how the body works and how sexual arousal works. And for that, we need to do lab research. Now, the problem is with lab research is that most often we let individuals watch a pornographic movie and then we measure their genital arousal. But then you can say, well, this is strange because you're watching porn. This is more related to solitary sex rather than having sex in a relationship. And we know that if there are problems with sexual arousal, it most often occurs while having sex with a partner, not during masturbation. People don't have issues while masturbating. So why are we studying sexual arousal when individuals are watching porn? So that was one of the first observations I made when I started to do sex research. So I thought, let's just enter partner in the sex lab, and we just have to make sure that both partners are watching porn together. That makes more sense, right? Oh, I get a nice cocktail. Well, thank you. I was seeing all these nice cocktails, and I have water, so you see, I don't drink water. I'm going to drink cocktail. Oh, it's a nice one. You should try this. Not too much, because otherwise I'm going to start talking about my own sex life, and that's... my friends know that already. Then when I start drinking, then I'm always open to start about talking about sex, but my partner can be sometimes ashamed when I'm too open. And he's in the room here, so I'm not going to disclose. Now the thing is, so I did this first study in which partners were watching porn together, and we thought, I thought like, oh, this is going to have different results, and maybe we will find like a more connection with women, that they connect with their body and mind. But we found actually that when partners were watching porn together, it actually had a negative impact on the sexual arousal of women especially. And then I thought like, oh, this is strange, because I thought it would be a more naturalistic situation. But then, yeah, you're sitting together, watching porn, they could not touch each other, they could not communicate. It might be a little bit awkward, because they also need to provide an estimate of how aroused the other was. So they felt a little bit watched. It didn't really work out, so we changed it a little bit. This is our sex lab in Maastricht, which is kind of a cozy living room. And what we do now is we ditch the porn. People stimulate each other. So that means that they can actually arouse each other, and then we are actually studying what is happening in their body. How do partners tune their sexual arousal toward each other? And this is what we call sexual synchrony, because we want to understand, we all know this phenomenon that when you are aroused, then, yeah, there's kind of a spillover effect. The more aroused your partner is, the more horny you get, and vice versa. So what happens? Like, how do people tune their sexual arousal to each other? And what happens, for example, when there is a sexual problem? Because is it then that one partner is dragging the other one down? Or can the other partner lift the other one up? What is actually happening? We don't know yet, because we don't do this research so far. So we actually, here in the Netherlands, we're actually the first researchers who are actually studying these dynamics in partners while they have sex in the lab. It's also interesting to understand, because when we have sex, we're kind of tuning sexual arousal toward each other, which is important because this is arousing. But when you climax, it's actually better to let go your partner, because at that point you need to be like, it's what we call the solo phase. You need to focus on yourself to let go. So then it might be not really adaptive to tune with your partner. So we are actually studying now how the sexual arousal works across stages of the sexual response cycle. Is it different? Is it better to be synchronous when you're aroused and not synchronous when you want to climax? We also want to know whether this kind of varies over the course of the relationship. Is it something that grows, that you get more attuned to each other when you get to know each other better? Or can it already be there from the beginning, and is it what we call the sexual click? Some people say we just match, we had it immediately, this sexual spark. Is that synchrony? We don't know yet. So this is what we actually are studying at the moment. I already talked about this climaxing, orgasm, focusing on yourself. We talked about desire, we talked about arousal. Mostly when you're aroused, at a certain point, you climax. Now, is that what sexual pleasure is? Is that what we want, the climax? I think what is really important to consider is that for men, this climaxing seems to be very important. They didn't have sex when there was no orgasm. For women, it might be a little bit different, that they have a broader definition of sexuality. But I think we need to consider that what do women need to climax, to have pleasure? It's what we call the foreplay, because what is it? It's stimulation of the clitoris. So with the fingers, with the tongue, that's all like foreplay. So what women like is kind of the bonus. Sometimes we skip the foreplay and we go immediately to the penetration, because foreplay seems to be the appetizer. And then you have the foreplay, which is the main course. This is wrong. The foreplay, that's the real sex. That's the main course. Penetration is dessert. Sometimes you had already enough. You don't want this little extra. Sometimes you want a little extra. So that's the way we should approach sexuality. Just putting less emphasis on this penetration part and just focusing on the whole sex. And this not only penis and vagina sex is real sex. And I think it's so important because, again, we often skip like this foreplay part, the part that women actually like during sexuality. So that is one of the most important part why there is an orgasm gap. Orgasm gap, which is the pleasure gap. And what is that orgasm gap? It's the fact that we have sex in a way that fits the male sexual script. So we focus on penetration. We skip the bonus. Also, what we see is that women tend to prioritize the sexual pleasure of men. They forget their own sexual pleasure. And that is one of the reasons why there is an orgasm gap, because when we look at heterosexual couples, 95% of the men always climax during sex, while it's only 65% of women. So that is a gap of 30%. When we look at penetration sex, it's 90% of the men climaxing, only 30% of women. Purely penetration, without stimulating the clitoris, is only a minority of women that can reach a climax. What do you do when you stimulate when you have penetration sex? You stimulate the back of the clitoris. That is what happens. And it depends on how sensitive you are, whether or not you will be able to climax only via this indirect stimulation. Most of the women, 2/3 of the women, need direct stimulation of the clitoris. Using your fingers, using a vibrator, whatever you want. If you want to climax during penetration, you will need to assist a little bit more. You need your fingers, you need something else. And this is so important. What is also interesting to see, if you look at the lesbian women, they actually climax much more than heterosexual women. Why? Because first of all, they take their time. Like, let's say a heterosexual sex takes about 10 minutes or something, 5 to 10 minutes. If we look at lesbian, it's the mean of 20 minutes, so it's double. And they use fingers. They don't use the penis or whatever for penetration. They use their fingers, they stimulate the clitoris, and this is so important. So let's go back to Freud, who told us that the vaginal orgasm was kind of the most mature orgasm and a clitoral orgasm was kind of an infantile orgasm. Well, that's not how it is. It's always a clitoral orgasm. The vaginal orgasm does not exist because the vagina is our birth channel. It's much less sensitive than the clitoris. All the nerves are in the clitoris, and that is really important so that we consider the clitoris as a female sex organ. You need penetration. I'm not saying that penetration cannot be fun. It is, but if you want to climax via penetration, you need to stimulate the clitoris using your fingers, using a vibrator, using whatever. Men can feel intimidated by the vibrator, like, oh, then they don't need me anymore. But obviously you also want to make love. Sex is more than purely this penetration part. So, and also you can actually use the vibrator also in non-heterosexual couples, in men. It's really stimulating. You can also climax just using a vibrator. So just integrate it in your sex play. What I also think is so important is that women want to climax too. We always say, well, men want to climax, and for women, they just want to cuddle and kiss. That's not true. Women also want to climax. And I think it's a big problem that because we put so much emphasis on this idea that women don't want to climax, that women don't look for their orgasm because they think, well, I'm complex, I'm a woman, it's normal that I don't climax, we read it everywhere, so that's why you don't look for it. I think it's really important that consider that sex and sexual pleasure is also about orgasm and climaxing. So go for it, look for it. And the best way to climax is to masturbate. Why? Because during masturbation, you're focusing only on yourself, on your own body, on what you need. It's the best way to discover what stimulation you need. Another thing is that your body has a motor memory. So once you climax, for example, when you use a vibrator, that will, I mean, especially the new air pulse vibrators that guarantee you the orgasm, it does. You will climax. At least a physical reaction, just having the experience, that's something else, but at least a physical reaction. Once you climax, your body will remember this orgasm. So whenever you have sex also with a partner, it will become easier to climax because your body recognizes the signals. So that's why I really think it's so important, start to masturbate. With your fingers, with whatever thing you find, it's perfectly fine. As long as you just stimulate yourself, explore your own body, and then the crucial part is to communicate it to your partner. Because if you know what you want, then you need to explain to your partner. For example, when your partner is giving you oral sex and he's making these circles with his tongue or he's sucking your clitoris and you really don't like it, you want like fast up and down, tell him. Tell that, I want that. I think it's so important to communicate and be more instructive towards each other because then you get the stimulation you actually want. Don't make it a technical exercise. You can also, explain this in a very subtle way, but I think that is important. So how can we attain more pleasure? I think you also want some tips, obviously. I think the first important thing is there's something in our society, again, the pleasure thing, is that we need to learn to say yes to sex. And I think in a lot of, especially in today's society, there's a lot on Me Too and sexual harassment and sexual abuse and violence, and I think it's a big thing and we need to focus on it. There's a lot on prevention. There's a lot about the negative side about sex. I think talking more about sexual pleasure might help against this negative view about sexuality, because what is the idea in our society is that men are testosterone bombs and they cannot help it. They transgress boundaries, they need to pursue, they take the initiative. And then women, we are the gatekeepers. We need to say no. But I think it's so important that women learn to say yes to sexuality. We don't need to be anxious when we're walking around in the dark. We don't need to be the ones saying no and then men transgressing. We need to educate both the girls and the boys to learn about consent, to learn about boundaries, and to learn about the preconditions for sexual pleasure, to learn men how the sexual system works in women and about the clitoris, which will help to attain sexual pleasure and to say yes about sexuality. Work towards gender equality, slut shaming, toxic masculinity, because also like being a man can also be very tense. I mean, you need to always be present. You always need to take the initiative to have sex. You always need to be ready to have sex, which puts a lot of pressure in men. We see a lot of young men nowadays with sexual desire problems. There's a lot of performance demand. There's a lot of failure anxiety. We are all talking about the female sexual pleasure, which is great, but before that, men were not really thinking about whether she likes it or not. And now they need to start thinking about, oh, well, my partner needs to like it as well. So that puts pressure, and people get kind of triangled into this situation. So I think gender equality, talking about the binary, non-binary, man, female, I think it's so important to consider that we are all humans and that we need to stop thinking about boxes and what men are supposed to react and how women are supposed to react. Let's focus more on human features instead of characteristics instead of men, women. Sex is really pleasurable sex among equals. I think that is the goal, the aim we're striving for. That was also the message that Ellen was really advocating. Let's be equal. And that's the best way to experience sexual pleasure. Just a small note on sexual consent. Sexual consent is not silence or lack of resistance. Sexual consent means affirmative, conscious, voluntary agreement. If you start with having sex and you're not resisting or you're not saying something, people consider this, oh, it's consensual. It's not. You need to communicate. It's asking whether it's okay, and it's the other one responding to it. That is what consent is about. I think it's important to know that consent is malleable and dynamic, which means that when you start with a sexual act, you don't need to finish it. It does not mean that you agree with everything. That means that if you say yes in the beginning of a sexual act, it might change because you might not agree to all sexual acts. And it's important that you check this with your partner, especially when you're dating and when you have sex the first time. When you have a relationship, then you might somehow assume that when there's a sexual precedent, that you then agree to sex even when you're not actively refusing it. But again, it's not static. It's not that what you agree on in the beginning of the relationship, that you agree on that for the rest of your relationship. You need to be aware of contextual cues. And that is so important that we stop thinking, oh, consent is just something you agree on the beginning and then you can do whatever you want. No, it's dynamic. You really need to check it's an active process. So consent is important because that gives you the safe context to explore. If you have sex with somebody, you're into it, but you don't really feel safe enough, like, is this partner going to respect my boundaries? Then you will not open yourself for the sexual stimulation. You will be inhibited, which will reduce your sexual pleasure. So it's really important to check this with your partner. So tips for more pleasure: make sex more rewarding. Make sure that the way you have sex is satisfying for you and for both of you. Broaden your sexual script. You can do very different things, trying out different positions. There are a lot of really nice websites, sex toys, erotic podcasts, erotic stories. I'm a big fan of the erotic podcasts. They're really nice because you can let your fantasy work. They're very popular. Check them out. You can see that they can be very arousing, and a lot of people react very positively to it, both men and women. Start with writing your own sexual script, which means be sure that you're in touch with your body, that you know what you want, and then you can start writing a sexual script together with your partner. And this is so crucial, the communication part. And I just want to have the final part of my talk is just really focusing on the importance of communication. Why? Because again, if you know what you want, then you need to communicate it to your partner. Okay, what do I want? What do you want? And again, we did this research in our lab. So we made people stimulate each other. We measured their genital arousal, their subjective arousal, their heart rate. And what we found is that in one condition, they could not communicate, not verbal, not non-verbally. They could not say they can stimulate each other, but without any type of communication. In the other condition, they were able to communicate. They could verbally, non-verbally tell each other what they want, what they don't want. What we saw that in the communication condition, partners were much better aligned. Their sexual synchrony, there was clearly an up and going of their sexual arousal. They matched. So it seems that this sexual synchrony depends on communication. So communication is very crucial to be on the same wavelength in terms of sexuality. But we find it very difficult to talk about sex. I mean, we talk about sex a lot. Our society talks a lot about sex, but that's sex in general. If it comes to our own personal sexuality, it's very vulnerable. People have difficulties. Why? Why is there such a shame? It has to do with a few issues. First of all, the myths. We have this idea that if you love each other, you automatically feel what the other wants. So you don't have to talk about it. And sex is spontaneous. And watching porn in a relationship, that's cheating. And masturbation is a signal that there's something wrong. And if your sexual fantasies, well, there's this deep, dark secret and you cannot explain this to your partner. We have all these ideas and we often feel ashamed about it. If we don't feel what our partner wants, we don't dare to ask because maybe that's a sign that a relationship is not working well. I don't dare to say that I watch porn. I don't dare to say that I masturbate. So there's so much, because there's this myth that it tells us something about the relationship, and that's why we're not open to talk about it. We lack the words to talk about sex. And this is actually stemming from our childhood. Children are really sexual. What means is that they are constantly asking questions about sex. Why do you have a penis? Why don't I have a penis? And you have hair and I don't have hair. And they ask questions about sexuality all the time. They're exploring their world. They want to understand their world. So they want to understand about gender differences and where do children come from and so on and so on. They display a lot of sexual behavior. I mean, if I touch my penis, oh, that's nice, I'm going to do that again. This is just pleasurable. It has no sexual meaning, but as adults, we are really scared of that. We are like, oh, we have to forbid that because children cannot have sex and they cannot ask questions about sex because they're too small. So we install a taboo. We install shame. We don't give words to these genital areas. We call it, we have eyes and ears and we give names to every body part except for the part between the legs. If you touch it, you get slapped. If you ask questions about sex, you're too small. So we actually give a lot of negative messages about sex. And that's why we actually don't give children the words to talk about sex. And we know actually that if you start talking with your children when they're 12-year-old, that's too late. Because if they don't have the habit to talk about sex with you, then it becomes awkward. So make sure that if you have children, just talk with them. Give them answers on their questions. Don't prohibit their behavior. You can put some social rules, but give positive messages because then you learn children that sex is a common theme, that it's very normal to talk about it. And then later on, they will be more encouraged to talk about sex with their partner. Another thing is why we are less open to talk about sex has to do with attachment. Attachment means that when you're born, you want to sort of, it's important that when you feel tired or hungry, that you give a signal to your mother or father, I need you. And whether or not your mother or father will pick that up, that will transform into schemes. Am I worthy of love? Are other people reliable? And these schemes, these ideas of, am I unique? Do you choose only me? Are you there when I need you? Can I be myself with you? Will you offer me security? These are our fundamental attachment needs. This is something we are born with and that continues to influence our relationships throughout life. We need this connection, we need this attachment. It's very fundamental. And because we have fear of rejection, we fear of losing this connection, and that's why we are less open to our partner. We don't dare to share our inner thoughts because we are afraid that our partner will reject us and will actually, that we lose the connection. And because attachment is so fundamental, it makes us kind of be less open about our sexual desire and our sexual fantasies. And this is clearly when we talk about sexual desire, we talk often about fantasies because we all fantasize about sex. We know that especially women fantasize a lot about BDSM. We fantasize about having sex with multiple partners. We fantasize about novelty, variety, taboo sex acts, being in a non-monogamous relationship, having sex with somebody of the same gender, even when you're like heterosexual. So we have these different fantasies, but we often don't dare to talk about it because of fear of judgment. Judgment of the partner, but also judgment of yourself. Because if you're like a very feminist woman and then you fantasize about being submission and so on, that doesn't match with your own inner values. And so you get kind of ashamed to judge yourself. And that's why we don't openly talk about it. So I think it's really important that we start to reflect on the underlying causes why we have so much difficulties to openly talk about sex with a partner. It comes from our childhood, it has to do with our fear of rejection, it has to do with judgment, it has to do with all our societal norms and gender role expectations, which actually inhibit our open expression about sexuality. And we still have a long way to go to open up to talk about sexuality. So to end this talk, I think it's so important. I try to sort of make sure that we embrace this idea of sexual diversity, that we are all unique, which means that sexual pleasure is universal, but it's different for each individual. We are different, and accept these differences, value these differences. Don't try to be the same, especially not in a relationship. Sexual pleasure is a fundamental human right, so I think that we need to also make sure that transgender, sex workers, people with a disability, there's so many groups, vulnerable groups, that we ignore their sexual needs, but they also have sexual needs. And I think it's so important that we start to think about sexual pleasure in these groups as well, because often in these groups, we're still in the stage of prevention and be careful. No stereotypes, no judgment, you do you. Just explore your sexuality, and I think it's so important. Let's make sex great again. It's all about pleasure. Thank you.